Special treat here. We have the co-founder and CTO of CrowdStrike, Dmitri Alperovitch. You may have seen him on CNBC and CNN discussing policy with Washington elites. And many people try to think of the Managing APT-1 report as like the first big outing of APT. You know, that was a great report. Nothing wrong with that. But before that, Dmitri was responsible for some awesome reports for Night Dragon, Shady Rat, and his role as CTO over at McAfee. So definitely one of the people that's a thought leader at InfoSec, and we're really lucky to have him. And as a happy CrowdStrike employee, I'm glad that I get to work with these guys. Please welcome Dmitri.
Thanks, Paul. Can everyone hear? All right. Where's the... Right here? Sorry guys, technical difficulties. I show up on full conference. Should I use this one? Is that? Can I just turn it off? Yeah. How's this? Can you hear it? That's all right. All right. Thanks for having me, Paul. Appreciate it. So we're going to talk about animals. I thought this was going to be cybersecurity talk. Instead, it's going to be talk about pandas and cute little kittens. And does anyone know what a puma is? Yeah, it's a mythical flying horse, which is a national animal of North Korea. There are a few countries that don't have real animals, like Scotland, right, obviously, but North Korea, you know, they love inventing new shit. So. We'll talk a little bit about that after. Pretty fascinating, actually, in cyberspace. Who here does not think that North Korea hacked Sony? Show of hands. A few skeptics, right? We'll go over that, and you can make up your own mind. So before I start, does anyone know who CrowdStrike is? A few people, right? Well, just really briefly, we do a few things. One of the things we do is what we'll call next generation endpoint technology. So basically sensors that get installed on your Windows, Mac, Linux machines, servers, desktops, and deploy them through the cloud so you actually are able to report all the activities that are happening on the system from an execution perspective. So processes that are executing, system events, network events, those sorts of things. And in the cloud, we're able to correlate them and understand what is actually happening on the system and detect adversary activity. And we also apply our intelligence to it, so one of the things we do is intelligence tracking adversaries, and I'll talk, most of the talk will be on that, the various adversaries and their tradecraft that we're seeing across the world, but that's part of how we collect intelligence, is through all these sensors we have deployed across all of our customers, and we literally see every single attack, and literally on a daily basis we have engagements with advanced adversaries. Average day is about 2 dozen or 3 dozen engagements where we detect the Chinese or the Russians, or the Iranians and so forth, obviously a lot of criminal actors as well, and we are literally seeing every single command they type, every single file they try to exfiltrate, and we obviously try to thwart them before they're able to accomplish their objective. And we do incident response as well, leveraging our technology and other tools that we have in our IR team. One of the things that we've really focused on from a technology perspective is something that we call an indicator attack, really just to differentiate it from an IOC, right? A lot of you probably are familiar with IOCs. Nothing wrong with IOCs, but you have to understand what it is. I often find it funny, you know, walking the floor of RSA or other security shows where you have vendors that in the same breath will tell you signatures suck and will say IOCs are the future, right? An IOC is a signature. Right? It's a hash, it's a domain name, it's an IP address, it's what we used to call a signature. Nothing wrong with it if you have good intelligence and good IOCs, but you have to understand the limitations of that. Sometimes they will change, and you may not have advanced knowledge. So how do you detect an adversary, like Nirvana, that's using all the tradecraft that's completely new, different IOCs, so setting up infrastructure that's totally unique for your victim that's never before seen, new malware and so forth, right? And that's really where the concept of the indicator attack comes in. And what it means really is you're focused not on how an adversary is doing something, but what effects are they trying to achieve, right? An example I want to show you in the real world, how do you know that a bank is being robbed? Well, the IOC approach is to say to every teller, here are pictures of known robbers in the area. Someone walks in, you look at their face, you compare it to the picture. If it matches, tackle them, call the police, take some sort of action, preventative action. Another approach would be to say, well, if you see sequence of events, if you actually instrument the whole banking environment, right? So every single person in the bank is going to be tracked, and you can understand every action that they're taking. And if you see someone getting from the outside into the bank, somehow, they could walk through the door, they could jump off the roof, they could go up through the basement, millions of ways to get in, right? But somehow they're getting in, so you're reporting them that they're inside. They're stealthily disguising their identity to hide from the cameras. They're going for the vault. They get inside the vault. Again, numerous ways to do that, blowing it up, picking the lock, putting a gun to someone's head and asking them to open it nicely, and getting inside the vault and carrying money out. You know that that's a bank robbery in progress. Because guess what? For them to accomplish their objective, for them to win, that's what they have to do. They have to get inside. They have to get inside the vault. They have to get the money. They have to leave. And if you're seeing someone doing that, guaranteed a bank robbery. Doesn't matter how they do it, doesn't matter what they look like, doesn't matter what they're wearing. That's the effect that they're trying to achieve. That's what you need to look for. So what are the things you need to do to actually accomplish this? Well, one, you need complete visibility, right? You need to track every single person that's inside your bank. You need to understand all the actions that they're taking. So someone walking inside the vault is not necessarily bad activity because you may have a legitimate teller or manager that has to do that on a daily basis, so you don't want to trigger on them because that's a false positive. But someone walking in from the outside, getting in the bank, carrying money, and walking out, that's a bank robbery problem. So what does it mean in cyber? Well, very similar thing. You have a chain of activity that takes place where you have an application like a web server that starts executing processes. Those processes start elevating privileges, conducting network reconnaissance from that machine that they've established a beachhead on, injecting a threat into a system process and stealing a credential from memory from the LSAS process. Using those credentials to log into Exchange, for example, and taking a mailbox. That's an intrusion, right? Notice that there's not one single IOC on that slide, right? I didn't tell you what exploits were used, what malware, what IP addresses they had come from. But if you actually are able to instrument the system, that you understand every action that's taking place, you actually know that, one, you have code execution that's taking place. You have privilege escalation. You have credential theft that the adversary is executing, reconnaissance, and exfiltration of data and so forth. So all the steps of the kill chain become very, very apparent. So that's a strategy that we need to move towards, focusing on the effects of what the adversary is trying to achieve versus trying to track down every single tool that they use. All right, so that's my little spiel on strategy. Let's talk about the adversary groups that are out there and that we track and you folks should care about. So numerous groups, I couldn't fit them all on one slide. I highlighted sort of a representative number of groups. We do have kind of a unique naming scheme that we're known for in the industry. A little bit tongue-in-cheek, so we picked an animal theme when we started the company. And one of the things we really wanted to do is make it recognizable so that people would immediately understand who we're talking about when they hear that we're saying Panda. They may not know exactly who that actor is, but they know that Panda is a Chinese nation-state sponsored adversary, so we're talking about some group operating out of China tied to the Chinese nation-state, and then they can dig deeper and sort of understand who this group is, who they target, and so forth. So out of major nation-states, you've got a variety of them, but the big ones, obviously China, Russia, Iran, North Korea. India is a pretty big player nowadays as well. And then, of course, we track activist and terrorist groups as well. Terrorist activist groups under the cryptonym of Jackal, so it's going to be something Jackal, and then criminal groups under Spider as well. So that helps us to have a common language, and we're actually seeing other companies and even government agencies starting to adopt these names because it's so easy to make it clear who it is that you're talking about. And for every group, we try to understand, first of all, what are their motivations and capabilities. So we track them by industry, so which industry is deep Panda targeting, well, financial, technology, nonprofits, and some others as well. I couldn't fit them all on the slide. But this helps you to understand which groups you really care about, right? If you're in the telecommunications sector, you need not care about the hundreds of groups that are out there. You may need to care about 20. And one of the things you want to do is really appreciate who is your enemy, what are they interested in going after inside your organization, and how will they do it. So that proactive intelligence helps you to actually prepare your environment, perhaps re-architect some solutions, knowing the tradecraft and capabilities of those groups, and then prepare your hunters, prepare your defenders to actually monitor your environment for that activity. All right, so let's talk a little bit about some of those actors in a little more detail. But before I do that, I want to highlight one of the kind of broad trends that we're starting to see from more and more actors, and more advanced actors. One of the things that they're realizing is that the industry is actually getting better. And some of the statistics you see out there from us and some of our competitors show that the amount of time that it takes for an average organization to actually detect an atmosphere shrink is still very, very long. It's still measured in a number of months, but it used to be years. So the actors are now starting to get some pressure. You know, before they were operating where they could get into an organization, stay in there for years, and continue to exfiltrate. Nowadays, they may get discovered in 3 or 4 months, and they have to get back in again. So they're starting to think, how do we stay stealthy? Because it's a lot of effort to actually do the offensive work, as Rob was highlighting. It's pretty human intensive. While you do rely on automation and other things, you still need operators that are doing the reconnaissance, they're doing the intrusion. So at some point, it doesn't really scale when you're going after tens of thousands of targets. So you really want to make sure that you can get into a target and then stay in there for as long as possible. So in response to the improved hunting capabilities on the part of victims, the adversaries started to realize that malware by itself is very noisy, right? It's doing some network calls out that you may be able to detect from your network forensic gear. At the root of it, you have unknown binary that's running in your system. So if you're doing some sort of IOC scanning or even just basic anomaly analysis, trying to find unknown binaries that may be running in your system, you may be able to identify this. And a lot more organizations are doing things like scanning what services are running and so forth. So how do you evade that? Well, one way to evade that is to actually not use malware. And the really nice thing that you have nowadays is that everything you actually need to execute an operation is already built into your operating system. On Windows, you'll see some of the tools as I go through the straight path. Very, very powerful. You don't actually need to bring in a single binary onto the system to actually do everything that you need to escalate privileges, steal credentials, move around, and so forth. So one of the other reasons they're doing that is they realize that the hardest problem we have in this industry from a defensive perspective is to actually catch an insider, right? Someone who has legitimate access and authorization to be there, knowledge of the network. Oftentimes we don't monitor our administrators or our security personnel. And once someone has administrative privileges, they typically have a key to the kingdom and they can do whatever they want, right? So that's the hardest problem we have in the industry. And the adversary realizes that if they can just adopt the insider persona, they win, right? They can do whatever they want, and chances are they won't be caught for a very, very long time. So from an external adversary's threat perspective, one of the things we're seeing, and the 60% number is actually from the Verizon Breach report, a recent report they've done, where aggregated across the industry, aggregated across all the investigations that Verizon does, CrowdStrike, Panda, and others that contribute to the report, about 60% of intrusions don't actually rely on malware, right? So that's a pretty striking number, right? The whole industry right now is so focused on how do we identify malicious code, how do we use virtual machine introspection, all the rest of the techniques that are out there, and the adversary is increasingly not even relying on those tools. So the goal is to become an insider, to blend in, decrease the chance of discovery, avoid being noisy that malware will actually cause, limit suspicious network traffic that's going outside the environment. Use the tools that are already there. You don't need to use malware, you don't need to use C2, you don't even need to use any file-based artifacts to achieve your objectives. So let's talk about how this actually happens. So first of all, they need to gain access, right? The most prevalent technique that we're now seeing for intrusions from nation-state actors is not spear phishing, it's not waterfall attacks, it's actually web shells. What they're realizing is that in any medium-sized to large-sized enterprise, there's so many web servers are out there, there's so many OW Exchange servers and so forth that are misconfigured or have custom applications that if you can just find that one SQL injection vulnerability, a web app exploit that allows you to upload a tiny file, a file that can be as little as 80 bytes long, that would allow you to execute commands on that server, they're right. And literally, on an almost daily basis, we're seeing this type of activity. So, a Webshell, literally, this is an example of it. This is something called a Chopper Webshell, something China Chopper, something that's a preferred tool from Chinese adversaries. But all it is basically, when you strip out the language tags, is an eval command with a password that it supplies. So that if someone goes to that URL where that script is hosted and they don't have the right password, nothing shows up. If they provide the right password, they can essentially execute any command they want. And there are graphical user interfaces built to connect to those tools and do everything that you need. Have a remote shell, upload files, download files, pretty much complete remote access tool that does not essentially run in the sense of run as a process on your system. So if you're looking at running processes, you'll never see it. If you're looking for outbound network connections, there are none. It's only listening for HTTP requests, which are going to your web server, presumably at an incredible rate, and it's responding to those inbound commands. So that's step number one, gain access. Step number two, elevate privileges. Oftentimes you don't even need to do this. I don't know how many of you know this, but Exchange OWA, by default, runs with system level privileges. The IS web server that Exchange uses for IWA runs with system level privileges. So you get a web shell on it, game over. Right? Any command you execute will be executed with system level privileges. But sometimes you do need to use it. Well, luckily you can actually use a tool called PowerShell. Already on the system, and you can do pretty much anything you want with PowerShell. Super powerful. This is an example of a command we've seen that allows you to basically do ProVest with PowerShell. I'm not showing you the PS1 script. There's actually a lot of binary code in there, a lot of assembly. But this is Windows kernel 0 day that we uncovered a couple of years ago, used by a Chinese actor called Panda, that was exploiting vulnerability in the Windows menu API that allows you to get system level privileges, and there's a PowerShell version of it, as well as a binary version of it, that allows you to execute that one command from a web shell, and anything you run will actually execute with system level privileges. Third step. You've got system on machine, what do you need to do next? Well, typically that one machine that you just hit is never the machine you actually want to be on, right? You want to get inside the environment, you want to find the file share servers, you want to find Exchange, maybe a custom application that you're interested in stealing, whatever that may be. It's almost never going to be on that one machine that you get unless you're incredibly lucky as an adversary. So what you want to do is dump credentials. Almost every single adversary we see goes through that step. I don't care if they're a nation state, criminal group, a hacktivist group, they have to get credentials to do anything within your environment. You stop that, you stop lateral movement, right? There's nowhere for them to go. Yes, they compromise one machine in your environment, but one machine does not make a successful breach. So this is an example of Mimikatz, PowerShell version of Mimikatz. It's base64 encoded, but essentially it executes a PowerShell script that loads dynamic DLL into memory, no file-based artifacts. It loads it into LSASS, dumps scripts, and will show you passwords. In Windows, prior to Windows 8.1, it will actually show you plain text passwords. After that, it will show you hashes, but that's okay because you can use passive hash techniques to accomplish your objective. Very powerful. So this is the actual command that it translates to. It actually does a download of a script. Typically, this version of Mimikatz is hosted on GitHub, so you will see a lot of downloads from GitHub. Sometimes they'll post it on their own servers, and it invokes it, dumps scripts, and outputs it to a text file that they can live view. So now you have credentials. So now you can move safely inside your environment. But that's not enough typically, right? If you want to maintain persistence, you want to make sure that you can keep coming back into this environment, even if the password has changed. How do you do that? Well, this is a trick that's been known for ages, literally probably at least a decade. But shockingly, we still encounter on a daily basis adversaries love this technique called safety keys. How many of you have heard of this? A few, right? So you basically set in the registry the command prompt to be the debugger for an application like Sticky Keys or Windows Access Manager and a few other programs, and it allows you to RDP into that machine, hit the hotkey, and instead of logging in, you'll actually get the remote shell, command prompt with system level privileges that you can execute command in. The side effect, the really nice side effect from an adversary perspective is it will not generate any login activity in your Windows event logs, so it's a very stealthy way for you to maintain persistence, because again, nothing is running on the system, there's just one registry key that was put in place, and at the same time, you're not generating any login activity in the logs that someone can track. So that's one way. Another way that we see less frequently, but nevertheless do see, is using something called the golden ticket, the Kerberos golden ticket. Show of hands, people have heard of that? Good. I won't go through this, but basically allows you to, again, using the PowerShell version of Mimikatz, generate a golden ticket, and then use that golden ticket for lateral movement. That golden ticket can persist for decades, actually doing remediation is a huge pain to reset, because you actually need to reset the password for the Kerberos ticket granting user twice. To make that work, you'll break all the connections, all the persistent services that are using it, and can cause huge pain in the enterprise during remediation. So the adversaries love to leverage that. So to recap, using essentially PowerShell and a Webshell, 8-byte Webshell, we're able to gain access, elevate privileges, dump threads, maintain persistence, and move laterally, again, via WMI and PowerShell, without using any malware, without using any malicious C2, and can hide away from any tool that's IOC reliant, or any tool that's looking for malware. So I like to say that PowerShell scripts are really the new malware. They bypass whitelisting. Right, you can't disable PowerShell in your environment because it will actually break so much of the infrastructure that you have in place. Exchange cannot be run these days without PowerShell. It bypasses AV, IC detection, and other things. All right, so let's talk about some case studies that we've seen with this straight up. So this is an interesting story. Around Christmas of last year, I get a call from a buddy of mine who's a CISO at a large defense contractor. Very sophisticated firm, has lots of forensics gear on the host, on the network, very, very capable team, and he's like, hey, Dmitri, you gotta help me. I've been battling this actor, Chinese actor, we call Aurora Panda, Aurora for the name of the Ghoul operation, the Ghoul hacked by China, so same actor. We've been detecting them intermittently throughout our environment for the last 6 months. We can't figure out how they keep coming back in. So the only thing I want you to do, and this was kind of a unique request, because typically when we get a request like that, we come in and we do full investigation, remediation, write a long report. He says, I don't want any of that. I want you to just come in and as quickly as possible tell me the C2 server they're using so I can block it at my firewall, and that's all I really need you to do. Don't even write a report. Just come in quickly and discover it. Well, we actually failed to do that. Because when we came in and we rolled out our Falcon endpoint technology, we realized that there was actually no malware to discover and there was no C2. What the adversary had done is get inside the environment, stolen credentials, and stolen the seeds for their RSA tokens that were now inside the organization, because after their RSA hack, RSA stopped keeping the seeds. So now you are responsible for the seeds, and of course the adversary can get it right out of your environment instead of having to hack RSA now. And they were coming in through VPN with legitimate threats, generating token keys, and moving around using PowerShell and WMI without any malware and without having to use any command control channel. So in fact, you can call your VPN server your command control channel, but you're likely not going to block that. So we had to help them do an actual remediation event and reset the threads and reset all their RSA seeds to actually get the adversary out of the environment. So one example where sort of the myopic focus on malware and C2s was actually hurting the organization that was very, very capable, but just couldn't get past doing IOC scans to try to detect the adversary. Another interesting situation, Hurricane Panda, an actor that we keep battling in a number of organizations pretty consistently over the last couple of years. Probably one of the more capable actors that we've seen out of China. First saw them in mid-2013. primarily focused on telecommunications and technology industries, and loves Chopper Webshell, loves that kind of malware intrusion capability, loves some zero-day exploits that we've seen from them, and this is actually pretty rare, with Chinese actors. They reuse a lot of exploits. A few groups are specializing in some zero days, but typically you will not see a zero day every day in your environment for good reasons. But this particular actor, this is actually a pretty interesting story. We first saw them about 2 years ago. We got a call from a technology company, and they asked us for help for our team to come in. And they said, hey guys, we're seeing some weird stuff in our environment. We think there may be compromised, but we're unsure. Can you come in and identify what happened? So we came in, rolled out our endpoint, and realized that the network was thoroughly infiltrated. They had admin privileges. They were moving around like there was no tomorrow. And we went through a remediation event, helped get rid of all the compromised activity, reset the passwords, kick the adversary out. What happened next, though, was a really interesting piece, because a lot of people tend to think of intrusions as a discrete event, right? An organization gets hacked, they call up an IR team, or they do it themselves, they clean it up, the CEO writes a heartfelt letter to their customers, they give you credit monitoring, and they say everything is good again. The reality is, particularly with nation-state actors, is that they still have a mission to do. So unless they've really taken everything that you've got and they don't no longer need you, which is rarely the case, they need to keep coming back. And if you're a military personnel in a PLA, your mission does not stop just because you got discovered and kicked out. Your general still expects you to do your job. So guess what? The next day you're trying to get back in again. And that's what often happens, is by the time the CEO is writing that heartfelt letter to customers apologizing for the intrusion, they're probably already hacked again. So you have to think of this as a persistent campaign as opposed to the discrete event that happened once. And I think OPM is a great example, right? We know of a few breaches that have happened at OPM last year, a couple this year. The reality is that that was probably an ongoing campaign where they were continuously compromised, and it's just that at discrete intervals every 6 months or so they were discovering these compromises. So same thing happened here. So as soon as we did remediation, literally the next day, these actors tried to get back again. And they were trying this for about 4 months, literally on a daily basis, for shutting down their compromised activity from different systems that they were trying to land on, and literally shutting it down within a couple of minutes. The team within the customer environment got really well, really good at shutting it down and getting things closed down. It was actually funny to see, because we were watching every command the adversary would type, so they very quickly realized that they only had a few minutes to really do anything. So they were getting on the system and trying to get a few commands off, and they were mistyping and misspelling commands and so forth, because they were under the gun and realized they only had a few minutes. So this went on for about 4 months, and then it was clear that something changed in about October of 2014, and they brought in an A team. That A team came in and they immediately deployed a zero-day, this kernel zero-day that I mentioned earlier, and we actually picked it up with a Prodesk IOA that we have. We're basically looking for the effects of a process becoming a system process through some sort of activity. We don't care how it's been done. We picked it up, we analyzed it, we realized that the machine was actually fully patched, and this was actually a zero-day, and reported to Microsoft. Microsoft issued a patch in a few weeks, clearing it out, and then we saw all activity cease. So 4 months of effort, of persistent attempts to get into the environment, deploying a zero-day, they got burned, and then the end of the activity inside that customer. And initially we didn't know what to think of that. We thought they would lose some visibility. We checked everything. We weren't seeing any activity whatsoever. So we decided maybe they just gave up and moved on to another target, which is exactly what happened, because 3 months later we get called into another customer, which I'm not yet a customer, but another company in the same sector that was seeing basically the same type of activity. We come in, immediately realize, same actor we just had a friendly engagement with, and basically go through the same process. We clean up the network, and then they keep coming back in. And that continued for about 2 months, and then 2 months later, really interesting thing happened. We saw them get on the system. At this point, we've been battling them for at least 8 months on an almost daily basis during that period at different customers. And I think prior to that point, they still weren't realizing how they were being discovered so quickly and how they were being shut down, but as well. And a lot of interesting activity we're seeing from the bears is really about the start of this year. Obviously, from a geopolitical perspective, you have the sanctions that are in place against Russia, causing pretty significant economic isolation and downgrading of the economy, and they have to respond somehow, right? So what is their response? It's to ramp up significantly their both economic as well as political cyber espionage efforts. So the Russians are very good. They've been at this for as long as we have been, and they know what they're doing, and they have a variety of groups tied to their intelligence agencies that are doing this. Some of them you see on the slide here. Cozy Bear is an actor that's particularly active that we've seen. They've been in the news recently, targeting the White House, the State Department, and other entities. But one of the interesting things about Cozy Bear is they're actually pretty simplistic tradecraft to get into an organization. So oftentimes you would think, you know, the FSB or the GRU, the intelligence agencies of Russia, that they would be very, very good, and they are. But the tradecraft for them to actually breach a network is super simple. These guys don't even use exploits. They don't even try to spearfish you with documents or PDFs. They literally send you oftentimes an e-fax notification with an executable. Now what they do though is they send it to a huge number of people within your environment. So hundreds and hundreds of employees. And all they need is one to click on it. Once they click on it, they jump on the box, and that's when you see really, really cool tradecraft where they're able to move around and own your network literally within a couple of hours. Chinese would typically take weeks as they're stumbling around trying to figure out what's what. These guys know what they're after, know how to elevate privileges, get credits, and own your network and then disappear inside your network very, very well. So that's when you see the really sophisticated tradecraft come in. But they don't want to burn 0 days on every target, and nowadays, since the sanctions have been put in place, they really have dramatically escalated their targeting. It used to be pretty focused on national security targets, defense, government, some financial. Nowadays, we're seeing them in a huge number of sectors of the economy because they're trying to build up their industries that are suffering from sanctions. So the IP theft became much more important to them. And they also care a whole lot less about being attributed. So when you invade another country, probably being caught in a cyber espionage case is not that big of a deal, and the Russians clearly have stopped caring. So they're doing these massive campaigns, waves of campaigns of doing spear phishing. Very simple methods, and we even had customers sort of say, this can't be the Russians, it's a freaking executable, I got an email, this is something like a script kiddie out of Nigeria would do. And sometimes you can't just think about, as Rob mentioned, that if it's a nation-state actor or even a sophisticated nation-state actor, that every single thing they have to do would be super sophisticated. If they've got a key to your door, they're going to use that key. They don't have to disable your alarm system. All right, so let's talk about North Koreans. So a few people, I think, were skeptical that North Korea was responsible for Sony hacks. So let me give you some evidence, and you can decide what you think of it. So first of all, everyone sort of woke up to destructive attacks when Sony happened. This is not the first time we've seen destructive attacks by any stretch of the imagination. Even in recent years, attacks at oil and gas companies in the Middle East. Of course, Saudi Aramco and Rasgas were pretty impactful. But even long before that, I mean, I can go back to the Chernobyl virus of 1997, if you folks remember that, and some of the malicious worms back in the 80s that have been doing some sort of soft level of destruction. One of the things we did at the RSA conference a couple of years ago is actually started thinking about destruction and what an adversary could truly do on a PC platform conducting destruction, because virtually everything we've seen so far from adversaries has been focused on data deletion, at most maybe some firmware overrides to make the machine unbootable, so reflashing the BIOS or something like that we've seen from the Chernobyl virus. But most of the things now just rewrite your MBR and have that message flash, OS not found, when you try to boot the machine. Nothing that's too destructive. So one of the things we want to do is see what we could actually do on a modern PC to cause hardware destruction. And we did a couple cool things where in one scenario we were able to jack the CPU up, the CPU temperature to 100 degrees Celsius, boiling water temperature, which this was done on an Apple machine and on a Mac, and the Macs are actually built really, really well. So what we're trying to do is set it on fire, and unfortunately there's a lot of electronics in the system to prevent you from doing that, but you can fry the electronics basically and completely disable the machine, permanently disable the machine. We have to get a new one, not just reload the operating system. So that was one really cool thing. Another thing that we did is actually reflash the ASIC. So we did a spearfish type of attack where we're able to compromise the machine, elevate privileges, and then flash the ASIC chip on the machine, and that basically completely breaks it as well. Without very specialized equipment, there's no way you can recover it. You have nothing, literally. The power supply doesn't come on, monitor, the machine is completely dead. So some of those things we were thinking about and trying to demonstrate and educate the population on what you can actually do to cause a really, really bad day inside an organization. Then a year later, Sony happened. So let's talk about Sony. First of all, that attack did not happen out of nowhere. There was a lot of things. If you have an intelligence unit inside your organization, if you were Sony, that you could have looked at, even just in the open source information, it could have told you that something may be coming. So it started with a pretty direct notice from the Korean Central News Agency that threatened stern and merciless retaliation if this movie had been released. That happened in June, so about 4 months before the actual attack. And then they followed up with letters to President Obama, to President Ban Ki-moon, complaining that this is an act of terrorism and so forth that you expect from the North Koreans. Then in the fall, you had the initial intrusion into Sony, and for about a couple months, they were getting their bearings. They were trying to investigate what's inside the network. They were exfiltrating information, and obviously stealing admin creds and preparing for the destructive piece of the attack. So November 24th is when the white malware was actually deployed inside the network, and the passwords that had been passwords they had stolen previously were actually coded inside the malware, so it was able to spread through network shares and deploy pretty widely across the network and start wiping the data on those machines. Then they followed up with the leaking, 8 separate leaks of confidential emails that you all have seen, and we know what happened next, threats of attacks, and Sony pulling the movie, President Obama coming out, and sanctioning North Korea and so forth. So let's talk about this actor. We call them Silent Kalima. We've actually been tracking them for quite some time. They're very, very active. We have activity from them going back to August 2006. So North Koreans did not just build a cyber program overnight. They've been doing this for over almost a decade now. And their capability is actually pretty good. I think that a lot of people were surprised by what North Koreans can do. I mean, frankly, any country that can build a nuclear weapon can also build a cyber weapon. So that should not be surprising. And they've been routinely targeting the Koreans and targeting the destructive attacks since 2009. I remember the first one I was actually working on at McAfee on July 4th, 2009, where a botnet in Korea started initiating DDoS attacks against the U.S. financial sector and government agency websites, and then they deployed a wipe malware on the machines that were part of that botnet and wipe them out. So then we started seeing the regular cadence of destructive attacks from this actor. So the first one we saw in 2009, 2011, 2013, and then another one in June of 2013. And those dates are actually pretty interesting because they coincide with a couple of operations that the U.S. military conducts jointly with South Korea. One of them is called Key Resolve, that's done biannually, where U.S. military trains with the South Korean military, and the North Koreans protest this every time and call it an act of war and say that they're going to retaliate. So what are the capabilities of those actors? So they have their custom rats, sometimes called Joker or Dark Soul rats. They're actually capable of doing multi-platform intrusions, so they can hit a Windows machine, steal SSH keys, and use that to log into Unix machines. We've seen them do destruction on Unix systems through DD and RM commands. They focus a lot on innovation from Korean antivirus, as you would expect, so on Labs and Ari. they focus a lot on. They do overwrites of MBR and are overwriting files. They have exploits that they use for privilege escalations on modern Windows systems. They do some crypto for obfuscating their exfil as well as command and control communication. Pretty good crypto, pretty well coded. One of the interesting things is you see a lot of focus on military espionage. So the malware is capable of looking for CAC cards that are used in DoD to authenticate to a machine by military personnel. And they also have capability to do automated exfil by scanning file systems for certain keywords and exfiltrate anything that relates to those keywords. And I'll talk more about the keywords in a second. We have lots and lots of samples from this actor that we've pulled over the years. A lot of these samples you can still take out the PDB paths that haven't been stripped out from those binaries, particularly in the early years. So these are some of the PDB paths. You can see the Korean names. You also can notice that they talk about team projects in the directory names, missions. So this is not something that's just a hobby for someone. This is clearly a team effort and something that's part of a mission that they were tasked with. Dates are really, really important in the North Korean culture. So we have one piece of malware that had an interesting file path in it that mentioned 1947, 1950, 1979. All dates very, very much relevant to North Koreans. 1947 was the call for elections in Korea. 50 was the start of the Korean War. And then you had an attempted coup and assassination of the South Korean president that happened in 1979. So these are some of the keywords. We translated them. These are the Korean names that the malware actually looks at to exfiltrate the data. So you can see very, very military focus, looking at battalions, brigades, Joint Chiefs of Staff, Q-Resolve, right, that exercise that I mentioned. Names of networks. Ripper is the Korean joint U.S.-Korean network that the military operates over there. NIPR obviously U.S. military networks. So any document containing those names would be automatically exfiltrated by the malware. All right, so we have all of this. What's the connection to Sony? Well, one, there was actually a bunch of overlap of tradecraft between what we've seen in the past from silent implement destructive attacks and what happened with Sony. But even more importantly, we had direct code reuse. So I want to show you a piece of code, decompiled obviously. So on the left, on your left, you have the wiper that was used by the silent implement actor against South Korean target, government target, in June of 2013. So a year and a half prior to the Sony attack. And then you have the Sony malware on the right. This is a function that's responsible for the spreading of the malware via network shares. So one of the things I highlighted is the function calls, the system APIs that the malware calls, and that helps you to understand that these functions are for all intents and purposes basically the same. But even more so, you notice that there's a string that's used here for service name, and you can see that there's a misspelling in the word of security, SECRUITY, the exact same misspelling done in both places, right? So, counter theory, someone could have taken this silent Kalima wiper from June 2013, which by the way was not publicly available. It's not on virus sold in a lot of places where you could get malware. We actually got it directly from the South Koreans. We're working closely with them. And most AV companies did not even have the sample. So an adversary that wanted to look like silent Kalima, maybe the South Koreans, would have had to take, one, get a hold of that malware, reverse engineer that malware, get that function, write it in a way that would compile back and decompile back to that code, which is actually not trivial, and make the same misspelling, and by the way, also reuse some of the infrastructure, some of the tradecraft that was used previously, and would have a grudge against Sony, and would also use the fact that the South Koreans would threaten retaliation against Sony for the movie interview. Possible? Maybe. I also have a British to tell you. Wrapping up here, the architecture of the malware, I won't go through much of this. There were multiple stages of the attack. One of the interesting things, if you sort of go to the high level of what they were doing, right? They exploited the network, they dump admin threads, they proceed to exfiltrate data, and the first 3 of those steps are things we see every single day. And then the 4th step is a little bit unique where they deploy this wipe malware. The reality is that if you actually had focused on the dumping of threads, which if you recall, as I mentioned earlier, virtually every adversary has to do to move laterally, if you had stopped them there, the attack would have been over. Right? They wouldn't have stolen any data, they wouldn't have exfiled it and doxed it, they wouldn't have deployed a web malware. So as you're thinking about countermeasures, really think about credential theft. This is one of the things that you really want to focus on, because reality is that there's numerous ways for an adversary to get in, right? Just like in the banking scenario, there's numerous ways to get inside the bank. But getting to what you want, getting to your objectives requires you to likely have admin privileges to move around the network. And if you disable admin privileges from most of your users, if you really tightly control that, if you focus on detecting credential theft and stopping it, you can actually prevent a lot of the activity that's taking place right now and make it life very, very difficult for the adversary. A couple of quick things. We do have free tools available on CrowdStrike.com, community tools. CrowdResponse is one of those tools. It's actually a version, kind of free version of the tools that our incident responders use themselves when they go out and investigate cases. So there are numerous modules we provided to basically deploy this tool and collect different information and analyze it. And it's really tailored to do kind of mass analysis. You can push it out to numerous machines, get the data back, and analyze it in a centralized location, push it into Splunk or anything like that. All right, well, I think I have a couple more questions, a couple of minutes to take questions if there are any. Yes, sir.
Why did there was so much focus on shifting blame away from security? And it's not just the government, US government, but we have a lot of security firms that are like, oh, no, I can't see it, which we obviously would try for years.
Yeah, well, we actually did attribution to North Korea on day 1, so we were very confident based on all the activity that we had seen that this was North Korea. The comment about security firms, many of the security firms did not dispute it. So kind of major firms, you didn't see Symantec and actually Kaspersky disputing that. You had a couple of firms that had no malware analysis expertise. I don't think even had malware, and were going out there saying that this is North Korea. And I was thinking during that time that the security industry is so unique. I can't think of this happening in any other industry. I mean, imagine if the government tomorrow comes out and says, the North Koreans have developed a new missile. A new missile that can reach Washington, D.C. And would you have some guy going on CNN saying, well, no, I looked at Google Maps, and there's no way you can fly that. Right? It wouldn't be credible, but, in this industry, everyone's a cyber expert. I think Rob had a cartoon on that, or a comic on that. So, unfortunately, you have that situation happening. Now, the government actually, we were working closely with them. They knew this was North Korea pretty much from day 1 as well. The reason they hadn't come out saying that is because they didn't know what to do about it. It took them about a month of internal interagency deliberations to actually figure out how we're going to respond. Because you can't come out and say it's North Korea and then you know. Right? At that point, you're on the hook. You had a major attack from the nation states against a company in the U.S. You had to do something. So oftentimes, when you don't see government commenting on attribution, they still haven't really formally commented on PM attribution, even though it's an open secret that it was China, because if you officially come out and say it, you have to back up your attribution to some action. And it took them a while to figure that out.
The FBI officials did come out and say, yes, this was...
Yeah, so they did. Once the White House decided that they were going to institute sanctions, that this was
unacceptable. Why would we sanction a country that was still in an official state of war?
Well, I think that speaks volumes about the levers, lack of levers we have to actually pressure a number of the states. So certainly with North Korea, there's not a whole lot we can do, and the people with sanctions were actually already sanctioned for other things. So there's a little bit symbolic. I think it was still a very good precedent for the government to actually come out and start talking about attribution, because we often have, I was talking about earlier, so many people that think attribution is impossible. It's not impossible, it's being done every single day. I just have one proof point for you if you believe attribution is possible. Why have we had literally thousands of people that have been arrested and prosecuted successfully for cybercrime? If attribution was impossible, none of these people should have been done. In fact, if you go back to one of the first cases we've ever seen of sophisticated nation-state cyber espionage happened in 1986. A book called Cuckoo's Egg. If you haven't read it, highly recommend it. The Russians basically hackers in Hamburg hacking into U.S. military installations to steal secrets. An astronomer at Berkeley, not even a security person, went through 2 years of effort to attribute them to finding out. So 1986 was the attribution. It's really cool. All right, thank you very much. Appreciate it.